there we see a wreck, and there we see something there. And then this thing popping up on the screen.
For over a decade, every expert who examined the object at the bottom of the Baltic Sea hit the same breaking point. Silence, then dread.
And you have this track at the bottom. So I remember Peter laughing and, oh, Dennis, you know, here's UFO. And I was, what? Nobody of us had seen anything like that before. Anything.
In June 2011, Swedish explorers Peter Lindberg and Dennis Asberg discovered a 60-meter disk resting 90 meters deep, with sharp geometric edges, burned surfaces, and a trench carved into the seabed behind it like something had crashed and dragged itself to a stop.
This is strange. This must be man-made.
Their equipment failed every time they approached. Tests identified basalt, a volcanic rock that should not exist there. Not ever. After years of failed explanations, specialists are now calling it something else entirely, the corpse of technology. And once you understand what that means, you will understand exactly why the truth is terrifying. The discovery, a routine treasure hunt that changed everything. The Baltic Sea is one of the most watched bodies of water on the entire planet, and yet something had been sitting undisturbed at 90 meters depth in absolute freezing darkness for God knows how long, and nobody found it. Not the NATO warships that cross it regularly, not the Russian submarines that prowl its depths. The men who finally stumbled onto the mystery were looking for old bottles of cognac. Dennis Asberg and Peter Lindberg run a company called Ocean X. Their entire business is built around finding historic shipwrecks in the Baltic, diving down to recover whatever cargo survived the centuries, and selling it. The specific mission they were running in June 2011 was focused on a wreck believed to be carrying cognac and Benedictine, with a potential cargo value in the millions of dollars. The mission had been brutal from nearly the first day. The rented fishing ship came so close to sinking that the entire team was forced into a Finnish harbor for emergency repairs. Most crews would have gone home after that, but not Dennis and Peter. They fixed the boat and went straight back out into a completely new search area they had never explored before. It was late in the evening when everything changed. The crew was exhausted in the heavy particular way that comes from weeks of frustration, close calls, and too little sleep. They were running the side-scan sonar, which sweeps the ocean floor and builds a two-dimensional picture of roughly 300 meters of bottom at a time, when the image on the monitor began to change. Something was there. It was round in a way that natural formations simply are not. And it was sitting on the bottom with a presence that made everyone in that control room go quiet very quickly.
This thing popping up on the screen, this huge thing. I mean, we're talking about 60 meters in diameter.
Peter looked across at Dennis and said exactly what came into his head. Dennis, you know here it's a UFO.
I remember Peter laughing and, oh, Dennis, you know, here's UFO. And I was, what?
The team began measuring immediately. The object came in at 60 meters in diameter, roughly the length of two full-sized passenger aircraft placed nose to tail. It rested 90 meters below the surface. Dennis would say later that in all his years of doing this work, he had never once seen anything as large as this object. Ross Carter, who interviewed Dennis 14 years after the discovery, told him directly that it really does look like a crashed spaceship. Dennis did not argue. Yeah, you're right. That's what we all thought when we saw the pictures. The object was named the Baltic Sea Anomaly. Then it picked up a second name that proved far more durable, the Baltic Sea UFO, because its sonar silhouette matched the Millennium Falcon from Star Wars closely enough to make people stop mid-sentence. That flat, disc-shaped smuggler's ship with the notched front edge that Han Solo flies in the films. When Ross asked Dennis whether he believed he had found Han Solo's actual ship sitting on the ocean floor, Dennis laughed and said, "You never know. I don't really know. It's not, but it is something for sure. That's why I'm struggling with it." The sonar image was extraordinary. But sonar only shows shape and shadow. When Ocean X finally sent divers and equipment down into the darkness 90 meters below, what they found with their own hands changed the conversation entirely.
And when we touched it, it turned black.
And what, do you know how that tech works?
Yeah, it's like a radar. You go down to the ground and you see all the layers in the sediment.
What they found, the features that defy natural explanation. Diving in the Baltic Sea is nothing like diving in tropical water. Anyone who tells you otherwise has never gone down there. At 90 meters, there is no sunlight at all. The water is dark, cold, and thick with suspended particles that reduce visibility to almost nothing. To examine the object properly, Ocean X deployed a remotely operated vehicle fitted with a Blue View sonar unit that produced a two-dimensional acoustic image of whatever lay directly in front of it. What that sonar showed on the monitor back on the surface ship changed everything the team thought they understood about what they had found. The object was not a smooth lump of rock. There were corridors, right angles that appeared to be precise 90-degree angles running through the structure with a consistency that natural geology simply does not produce, and holes in the surface with frames around them. One hole measured 2 meters in diameter with a clearly defined frame surrounding its entire opening. Dennis was direct about what the sonar was showing. When we look down at the object, we see all the corridors, the angles, but we also see this hole, 2 meters in diameter with a frame. Rock doesn't build corridors. When stone breaks naturally, it follows fault lines and stress planes. Basically, the weak points already baked into the rock by millions of years of pressure. The results are always jagged, irregular, random. You get cracks and uneven surfaces. You do not get straight lines, you do not get right angles, and you absolutely do not get circular holes with clean, deliberate frames around their edges. That kind of framing is a construction concept. It means someone looked at that opening and decided it needed a border and then built one. That is not something geology does. That is something builders do. Every researcher who reviewed the data came back with the same essential response. They had never seen anything like it in their career. And then Dennis found something else. Going back through years of archived photographs and footage from the site, he saw something he had somehow missed every time before. It was a triangle with a hole cut cleanly through its center, etched directly into the surface of the object. That symbol matters more than it might first appear. Think about this carefully. Triangle symbols show up across every major ancient civilization on Earth. In Egypt, in Mesoamerica, in Mesopotamia, in the megalithic cultures of Europe. These were cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by entire oceans, that arose completely independently between 3,000 and 12,000 years ago. And yet they all used the same symbol, not just as decoration either. In almost every case, the triangle appeared in a sacred or spiritual context, carved into temples, etched into monuments, built into the architecture of structures their builders considered the most important things they would ever make. Historians have never fully explained why unconnected civilizations kept arriving at the same shape and assigning it the same kind of significance. But here is the part that is hard to sit with calmly. If the Baltic anomaly is older than all of those civilizations, and the evidence suggests it is, then there are only two possible explanations. Either every one of those ancient cultures inherited that symbol from something that came before them, something so old it predates recorded human history entirely, or that symbol was never exclusively human in the first place. And all of that, the corridors, the framing, the triangle, pointed towards something deliberately made. But it was what the ROV found underneath the object that pushed the evidence somewhere even harder to explain. Beneath the structure, on its underside, the cameras picked up material showing clear evidence of burning or extreme heat exposure. Dennis described it carefully. It's like burned material, like something has been upheated. That's what we have experienced when we have been down there. Diver Stefan Hogborn went down specifically to chip a physical sample free. He came back up empty-handed. The material underneath was black and too hard to chip. with no fragment coming free under standard diving tools, pointing toward a material density fundamentally inconsistent with ordinary basalt or sedimentary rock. That burned material, sitting beneath the sediment at 90 meters depth, is one of the most inexplicable details in this entire story. The Baltic Sea has no volcanic history, and there is no known geological mechanism that produces burning at that depth in that region. Stockholm University researchers told Dennis the material could not have originated locally, and offered their best explanation, that it may have traveled from the Atlantic during the glacial melt period. Dennis received that answer with barely concealed skepticism, and honestly, that skepticism is hard to argue with. What burned it and when and under what circumstances has never been answered. The Finnish salvage professionals who came out to the site in 2019 are perhaps the most telling part of this whole chapter. These were experienced people who knew exactly what natural formations look like, and they came specifically to prove Dennis wrong. They brought their own equipment and examined the object on their own terms. When they surfaced, the man who had spent years laughing at Dennis looked him directly in the eye and said, "Dennis, this is man-made. This is constructed for sure." The physical features alone were already impossible to explain by any natural process. But what happened to the team's instruments every single time they approached the object suggested something far more disturbing.
A rocket disintegrating you would see up in the air. This is something that are looking basically horizontal out of the horizon, so space junk is not really a good.
When the object fought back. Here is something that keeps coming up in UAP research over and over again across completely separate incidents investigated by completely separate people. Whenever something genuinely unexplained is present, electronics stop working. Compasses start spinning for no reason. Cameras cut out at the exact moment they should be recording something important. Radar screens fill up with contacts that have no physical object behind them. This has happened enough times, documented by enough independent researchers across enough different encounters, that scientists who study this field now treat electronic interference as one of the clearest warning signs that something real and unexplained is actually there. When Dennis began diving on the Anomaly, he noticed that every time they got close to the object, things stopped working. Stefan Hogborn's camera cut out at depth while he was actively filming. His lights went dark while he was right there on the structure. Then the ROV compass started losing reliability the moment it came within a certain range of the object. Every time, without exception. When Stefan surfaced, he said something that stopped the entire team cold. The standard water temperature at 90 meters depth in the Baltic Sea runs between 4 and 5 degrees Celsius. But close to the object, the temperature Stefan recorded was 0 degrees. A temperature drop of that magnitude at that specific location points toward either a material actively drawing heat from its surrounding environment or a localized energy field somehow altering the thermal state of the water around it. Neither explanation offers any comfort. Next came the radar incident, which is the hardest single detail in this story to explain away. Ocean X had anchored directly above the object on a completely clear day, with blue sky overhead, and no other vessels visible anywhere on the horizon. They were entirely alone out there. Then the radar screen began filling with contacts. One dot appeared, then another, then more, clustering within approximately 150 meters of the ship on all sides, appearing and vanishing as though something was actively moving around them just beneath the surface. But when Dennis looked out at the water, there was nothing there. He sat with that data for a long time before saying what it had led him to conclude. It feels like this thing, or whatever it is, doesn't want us to come near it. Dennis is not a dramatic man. He is a salvage professional and a pragmatist who built his career around cargo values, weather windows, and the cold mathematics of commercial diving. When a man shaped by that kind of work looks at 14 years of data and tells you that an object does not want you near it, he is telling you exactly what the evidence led him to conclude. The malfunctioning equipment and the ghost radar contacts were already more than enough to make any rational person deeply uneasy. But when Dennis raised his eyes toward the horizon, he discovered that the anomaly had attracted a very different kind of attention, and the figures watching from that horizon were not researchers, fishermen, or curious civilians. They were warships. The Watchers, navies, submarines, and the Russian signal, The Baltic Sea is not just a body of water. It sits directly between NATO's eastern flank and Russia's naval ambitions, and it borders Russia's Kaliningrad exclave, a strip of Russian territory physically cut off from the rest of Russia and surrounded by NATO countries. Every major military power in the region watches that sea extremely closely. So when an unidentified object of this size and this nature turns up sitting on its floor, it does not stay a secret for long. The militaries were paying attention to the Baltic anomaly long before Dennis ever went public with what he found. One day, while Ocean X was actively working over the object, Dennis looked up from the dive operation and stopped cold. The horizon had filled with ships. Not fishing boats, not research vessels, warships. He counted between 10 and 15 military vessels arranged in a loose perimeter around his dive site. He identified British, American, German, and French Navy ships among them. And then he spotted something that made the situation significantly stranger. The Swedish Navy had sent a Corvette-class warship directly to the area. That matters because the Anomaly sits inside the Finnish economic zone, not Swedish waters. Sweden had deployed a military vessel into another country's territory without any announcement and without giving any reason. Dennis hailed the assembled fleet on the radio. None of them gave him an explanation. No NATO exercise had been announced for that area, no joint maneuver had been publicized, and not a single one of those ships offered any reason for being there. When Dennis got back to Stockholm, he arranged a meeting at Swedish Navy headquarters. He sat down across from a senior naval officer and asked the question directly, telling him that one of his ships had been positioned right next to his dive team and he wanted to know why. The officer looked at him and said, No, I have no information about that." Dennis heard that and said exactly what he thought. Of course they know. A senior Swedish naval officer claiming he had no knowledge of his own Navy's vessel is either a deliberate lie or an operation so classified that even senior officers were deliberately kept out of the loop. Neither possibility is reassuring. The Russians were watching too, but they made sure Dennis could not see them. Back in Stockholm, Dennis borrowed a specialized signal analysis device designed to detect and identify radio frequencies being transmitted in a given area. He took it out to the site, gathered his crew, and switched off every single piece of electronics on the boat one by one: telephones, satellite phones, radar, everything, until the vessel was in complete blackout. Then he activated the device and let it scan the surrounding area for any signals being transmitted nearby. He brought the recorded data back to Stockholm and handed it to the company that owned the equipment for analysis. Their finding was unambiguous. The device had picked up a signal dedicated specifically to the Russian Navy. No Russian ships were visible on the water, no submarines had broken the surface, but the signal was there. Dennis stated it plainly. "I did not see any submarines, I did not see any Russian ships, but the signal was there." He drew the only conclusion the evidence supported. "I strongly suspect the authorities do not want me to find out what this object is." And then the smear campaign started. Fox News published a story characterizing the Anomaly as a rock and framing Dennis as a man running a deliberate scam without ever contacting him directly. Dennis sent them an email laying out these facts but never received a reply. His response carried the energy of a man expressing genuine fury in very measured language. "Why are you going out with this information? You have not spoken to me. You have not been on the spot. You don't even know where it is." Dennis believes the campaign was organized and coordinated rather than a spontaneous editorial decision, and his reasoning is hard to argue with. If the object were simply a rock, there would be no institutional motive to discredit the man trying to study it. The military surveillance had already confirmed that powerful forces were paying very close attention to what Dennis was doing, but the physical evidence the team had actually recovered from the site was pointing towards something that no amount of institutional pressure could make disappear. The evidence: burned stones, Israeli labs, and what the science says. The Ocean X team could not extract a sample directly from the object because the material was too hard for any of their tools, but they recovered something almost as valuable. Lying directly on top of the structure were loose stones, and these were not random rocks. They had something on them that looked burned,
I get goosebumps all over my body. So I have never ever seen anything like that.
It was something that did not belong on stones sitting at 90 meters depth in a sea with no volcanic history and no known heating mechanism anywhere near that location. Dennis examined them carefully before sending them anywhere. When I saw these stones, it was like a burned thing on it. It was quite interesting to see. An organization in Israel had already reached out, expressing significant curiosity about the anomaly and requesting the opportunity to run laboratory analysis on any physical material he could provide. Dennis agreed and sent the stones across. He received 2 responses. The first was not a written report. It was a verbal question, delivered before the formal analysis was even complete, by researchers who had examined the material and formed an immediate impression they apparently could not hold back. That question was this: what have you found? How did you find some high-tech submarine? These were laboratory professionals examining physical material through a standard analytical process. They looked at those stones and their immediate instinct was not geological. It was technological. Their first human reaction was to ask whether Dennis had somehow located an advanced vessel. Dennis himself was stunned. What? What do you mean by that? The formal written report came afterward, and its finding was recorded plainly as biologic burned material present on the stones. Stockholm University researchers offered their most considered explanation. The burned-looking material must have been transported from the Atlantic during the glacial melt period, carried by shifting ice sheets over enormous distances and deposited at the site. It technically fills a gap while explaining almost nothing that actually matters. If the material arrived passively on a traveling ice sheet, why is it concentrated specifically on this structure and not distributed evenly across the surrounding seafloor? Why does it correspond directly to the burned material that diver Stefan Hogborn observed on the underside of the object itself? The burned stones were pointing towards something ancient that had experienced tremendous heat in a past the geological record struggles to account for. But heat from what source, under what circumstances, and dating back to precisely when, are questions that lead all the way back past the earliest known human civilizations to a period of Earth's history that conventional archaeology has barely begun to examine honestly. The implications. The Baltic Sea did not always exist in the form it takes today. Approximately 14,000 to 12,000 years ago, the last great glaciation was coming to an end, and the enormous ice sheets that had covered northern Europe for tens of thousands of years were retreating northward. As they melted, water levels across the region rose dramatically, and what had been dry land disappeared beneath the sea forever. The area where the Baltic anomaly now sits was, before those waters rose, open-air land that a person could have stood on and looked out across. If the object was constructed on what was then solid dry ground, it must be at least 15,000 years old and possibly as much as 20,000.
At first, one wouldn't have an explanation for what this actually could be. It definitely requires more work.
Ross Carter laid out the implication without any embellishment at all. Known human civilization did not meaningfully begin until approximately 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. Something 15,000 to 20,000 years old is not simply very old in the way that ancient ruins are old. Dennis heard that and did not push back against it. You're right. Ross pressed the point further. Shaping stone at the scale this object represents, 60 meters in diameter with precise right angles, framed circular openings and geometric symbols etched into its surface, requires metal tools, measuring instruments, organized labor, and a body of architectural knowledge that takes generations to develop. No human civilization attributed to that period is known to have possessed any of those things. The oldest confirmed large-scale stone construction site currently accepted by mainstream archaeology is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 12,000 years ago. When discovered in the 1990s, it forced archaeologists to fundamentally revise everything they thought they understood about early human capability. The Baltic anomaly, if deliberately constructed, may be 5,000 years older than Göbekli Tepe. Once the natural formation theory has been genuinely exhausted, only two explanations remain. The first is that there existed a pre-Ice Age human civilization sophisticated enough to construct a 60-meter geometrically precise structure, then erased so completely that we have found no other confirmed trace of it anywhere. The second is that the object is not human in origin at all, that it arrived from somewhere else under intelligent direction and came to rest on the Baltic floor through the violent trajectory that the mountain gouge and the 1,500-meter drag mark so clearly suggest. Dennis has lived with those two possibilities for over a decade. When pushed for his honest conclusion, he gave an answer that was careful and direct at the same time. I think it is something constructed, and I think it is something that is probably constructed on the spot.
And I say the same thing. I find something, I don't know what it is. I don't know. But it's odd, it's strange, it's unique.
And then he let the other possibility in through the same door. I'm not surprised if we have found a crashed UFO in the Baltic Sea. But Dennis had not arrived at that confrontation unprepared. Not through research or academic study, but through something he witnessed with his own eyes 25 years before he ever found the object. Dennis Asberg's personal UAP encounter and what it all means. Before you ask what kind of man spends 15 years fighting smear campaigns and refusing to quit in the face of institutional dismissal at every turn, we should ask what made him capable of it in the first place. The answer began in 1996. Dennis was a young entrepreneur at the time, successful and focused entirely on building his business and raising his family. He lived with his wife and children in an apartment on the outskirts of Stockholm. The apartment had a large window, and directly outside that window, visible from where he sat, was a Swedish military base. He had no interest in UFOs and no reason to develop one. Then, one early morning at around 3:30 to 4 o'clock, Dennis woke up feeling unusually fresh and alert. His wife was still asleep. He lay there for about 10 minutes, then got up, went to the kitchen for water, and came back and sat down in front of that large window. The military base was right there outside the glass, the same view he had seen 1,000 times before. Except this time something was floating directly above it that had no business being there. It took Dennis 2 or 3 full seconds to process what his eyes were sending to his brain. Frustration, disbelief, and desperate urgency all arrived at once, and he started swearing loudly enough to wake his wife. In the Swedish summer at 3:30 in the morning, the sun was already beginning to rise, and the object was catching that early light and reflecting it back in shades of orange, brown, and yellow. It was hovering above the military installation, completely silent, showing no lights of its own. The surface looked rough, and it was shaped like a cigar. Dennis turned to call his wife. He simply needed another set of eyes before he could trust his own. She looked at his face first, and whatever she saw there frightened her before the object itself had the chance to. Dennis turned back and the object was still there. Then it tilted. What had appeared as a cigar began to rotate slowly and reveal its true form. For 3 or 4 seconds, Dennis saw it clearly as a disc before it did something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up even years later when retelling it. Dennis ran across the bed and directly over his wife as he tried to reach the balcony on the other side of the apartment. By the time he got the door open, the object was gone completely. His wife came stumbling out behind him, still disoriented. Then the children appeared in the doorway shouting, "Daddy, Daddy, what's wrong?" The following day, Dennis went back to the site with his children to work out how large the object actually was. He identified fixed reference points on the ground beneath where it had been hovering and measured the distances between them, then used those measurements to calculate the size of what he had seen. His estimate came out at between 600 and 700 meters in diameter. To put that in terms that are easier to picture, most commercial airports are smaller than that. It was the length of 6 full city blocks placed end to end, hovering silently above a military base in the middle of the night. Dennis knew that what he had witnessed was not anything that belonged to the world as he had understood it. When 15 years later an object with a 1,500-meter impact track appeared on his sonar screen in the Baltic Sea, the connection between both incidents hit him with. When I found this in 2011, I thought, "What the heck is going on?" he said. Nobody is saying with certainty that aliens built something on the floor of the Baltic Sea. What is being said, by the evidence itself, is that something is down there that does not fit any natural explanation. You can decide what that adds up to. But Dennis Asberg already has. A man who spent his career hauling champagne bottles out of shipwrecks, who had no agenda and nothing to gain from a decade and a half of ridicule and institutional obstruction, looked at everything he found and arrived at a conclusion he has never walked back from. He is convinced we are not alone. And somewhere at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, 90 meters beneath the surface in absolute freezing darkness, something is still sitting there waiting to be understood.